The last wind of autumn slid down from the high spines of Montana and scattered the light like crushed glass across the clearing. It smelled of pine sap and iron cold, and the kind of silence that makes a person count their own breath to be sure they are still here. At the center of that quiet, a rectangle of rough pine had started to take the shape of a cabin. Fresh-cut logs lay in careful stacks. A ridgepole waited like a promise across two laddered trestles. Nails slept in a tin beside a dented cup. A woman bent her back to the wall frame and hammered. Eleanor Sullivan worked with a measured resolve that looked almost like prayer. Swing, set, breathe. Her hands were hardened in ways that Boston had never imagined a gentlewoman's hands could be, and her belly full with a winter child tugged on her lower back until the ache turned familiar enough to be ignored. She had learned the rhythm of her limits. She had learned, more important, that she would step past them anyway, because the choice was to finish this home or to face the world without one. She preferred wood to whispers. She preferred weather to pity. The day thinned and went pewter, and a thin crust of old snow clung to the needles of the trees. The sound of a single horse broke the hush. It was not a harsh sound, not the clatter of a showy rider, just the steady two-time of a bay, moving at a careful walk. From the aspen line at the edge of the clearing, a man appeared and drew rein. He sat easy weight forward, like someone who had more conversations with fences and seasons than with people. His hat brim was pulled low, but not to hide, only to make peace with the light. When he spoke, the voice matched the posture. "I thought this patch was abandoned," he said, tone mild, "but I see I was wrong." Eleanor straightened slow so the muscles in her back would not seize. She put the hammer down on the sill as if it might decide to jump, and turned. The man's bay tossed its head and breathed frost rings into the air. The man did not reach for anything. He only tipped his chin and took in the scene with a quiet, attentive care that felt different from curiosity. It felt like evaluation without judgment. That did not mean it was welcome. "This land is mine," she said. "If you are lost, the trail west is open." "Not lost," he answered. "Just riding the boundary. Clayton Hartwell's Circle, H 10 miles north." The name hung there between them with the faint, dry clink of status. Eleanor did not flinch. She stepped to the next stud and set a nail at a clean angle. "Did not expect to see anyone building alone," he added. His gaze did not pry, but it took in the facts. The rough cut of the joists, the fair line of the frame, the neat stacks, the belly under the wool dress. "Most do not," she said. The nail rang home. "And fewer still," he said, "in your condition." She lifted the next board weight, shifting to her heels, and the small shock of that movement drew a ribbon of heat across the side of her abdomen. She did not let the wince get to her face. "I did not come to match most," she said. "I came to start over." The bay stamped. Clayton dismounted in the unshowy way of men who have done it 1,000 times. He took 2 steps closer, stopped well short of any line she might mark with her eyes, and held his hands loose so she could see them. That small respect belonged to the wilderness code out here, as much as any word did. "I meant no offense," he said. "The work is heavy. I have a back that knows what it will feel like on your spine when the weather drops." "I have grit," she said. "What I do not have is time for charity." If the word stung, he did not show it. His eyes, a shade between gray and brown, that weather can polish, moved from her face to the log ends, where she had notched true to the square of the doorway. There was a spark there, not pity, not correction, recognition. "Not charity," he said, "respect." For the first time, she let her gaze settle on him. The face was the face of a man who had stood in weather and stood against grief. The hands were calloused across the cradle of the thumb from reins and rope, but the coat was clean and mended with tidy stitches. He looked like someone who knew what he owned and what he owed. She felt the old reflex rise, the one that lumped all men with hats and land under one rule. They helped to feel better about themselves or to own what they touch. She had learned that truth in rooms with carpets and wine, and in rooms with floors too cold to sleep on. She had learned to say no. "Circle H is not far," he said, nudging a shoulder toward the trees. "If you change your mind." "I will not," she said. She meant it in that moment. She meant it with every breath of the life she had dragged west to keep. He nodded once, as if the answer were not an argument to win, but a fact to file, and he put a boot to the stirrup and swung back up. The bay turned hooves, making soft, hollow pops in the cold ground. When they reached the aspens, he looked back. She was already hammering again. Good, his posture said. Then he and the horse went away. When their sound was gone, the clearing felt larger. The child inside her turned like a thought too large for the mind, and she pressed her palm there, answering that motion with one of her own. Eleanor was used to fear. Fear was a knot she kept in a pocket and worried with two fingers on bad nights. What she was less prepared for was the small, warm spark that had risen when the man had said respect. Hope is a dangerous ember in a cold country. You cup it, you own its burn. She worked until the light failed. She banked the fire until it wore a quiet red crown, and she sat on the threshold that was not yet a door and listened to the huge silence turn the world into a single living thing. If a stranger had come, then a stranger with a softer question. She might have said that hammering is a merciful language when you have no one to speak with. Strike set, breathe. The words it says are, I am here. I am not finished. I will not lie down. She did not sleep much that night. The wind found every seam. The ache found every angle. Toward the thin hour when dreams are weakest, a thought laid itself across her chest with the cool weight of a folded blanket. It was not about the man. It was about the line she had drawn around herself since the day a door shut and a certain set of shoes went away down a Boston street. She had built that line tall and tight and straight. Today a rider had come to the edge of the clearing and had seen the line and had not tried to cross. He had spoken from his side of it, and then he had gone. The morning would test her again. The snow would come, whether early or on time. The walls needed to be closed. The chimney needed a throat that would draw clean. The root cellar wanted more sand across the lid. All of it would be work that she could point to and say, see, I do not need. And yet, as she drifted at last with the fire, making a small gold room in the cabin that was not yet a cabin, another sentence slid into the same place as the ember of hope. You do not need it said, but one day you may choose. The thought frightened her more than the first blizzard. She turned on her side and put her palm against the slow tide of her child's breathing and counted 7 long breaths, the number her father had taught her when panic used to crowd her lungs the way crowds once had. Outside, the trees made a soft, patient sound like a hand smoothing a blanket. Inside, the last coal winked and held. The line she had drawn around herself did not move. Not yet. But in the dark, where plans loosen and truths step closer, she admitted this much and only this much. A man had come to the edge of her weather and had not tried to take it away. 3 days later, the prairie wore its frost like armor. White plates across the grasses and silver chain draped on every branch. The cabin skeleton stood braver now, though gaps still let the wind whistle through. Eleanor balanced a board across her shoulder, her breath hitching each time the child pressed down. The ache in her spine had become a second heartbeat, steady, unwelcome, constant. She set the board with a grunt and fought the nail into place, every strike a denial of weakness. A voice low and too familiar cut through the rhythm. You're pushing too hard. She spun heart-jarring against her ribs and saw him again. Clayton Hartwell standing with his bay at the edge of the clearing. He held a bundle wrapped in a checkered cloth, and the way his hands cradled it made her chest tighten. His clothes were simpler today, the vest gone, no gloves, only a wool coat dusted in frost. He looked less like a rancher's son and more like a man who had left warmth to face the cold. Eleanor gripped the hammer until her knuckles blanched. I didn't ask for company. No, he said, gently stepping just close enough to set the bundle on a stump, but I figured I'd come anyway. My mother sent this. Tea for nausea baby clothes, she knitted. She said you'd probably pretend not to need them, but she sent them anyway. Eleanor stared, torn between distrust and the ache of something unguarded. The bundle sat like a question she was afraid to answer. Clayton's gaze moved to the half-built walls, his voice calm but edged with awe. You've done all this yourself? She gave the smallest nod. Impressive, he said. Painful too, I imagine. The words cracked something in her, but she folded her arms, bracing herself against both cold and kindness. Why are you really here, Mr. Hartwell, slumming gathering stories to tell your mother? He met her accusation without flinching. I came because I wanted to, because I don't like the thought of you fighting through pain alone, not when it doesn't have to be that way. I'm not a charity case. I never said you were. She stepped closer, heat in her voice. You don't know me. You don't know what I've been through. Men like you offer help like it's some kind of blessing, but it always comes with a price. The frost between them thickened. He did not argue, only let her words stand. Then softly, some people offer help not because they think you're weak, but because they admire your strength. The sentence stole her breath. Her fingers trembled where they pressed to her sleeves. She swallowed, tried to hold on to the sharp edge of defiance, but the blade dulled against his calm. Clayton gestured to the bundle. I won't stay. Just thought you could use the tea. And maybe a reminder that not everyone who shows up is looking to fix or claim you. His honesty unsettled her more than any threat. She managed only leave it there. He nodded once, turned and walked back to his horse. She watched him go, pulse thundering louder than the wind. When the trees closed behind him, she let out a breath she had not known she was holding. Slowly she crossed to the stump fingers, hesitant, and unwrapped the cloth. Inside lay 3 small garments of soft yellow wool, each stitch tight and careful, and a tin of tea that smelled of ginger and mint. For the first time since arriving in Montana, something inside her cracked, not enough to collapse, but enough to feel. That night by the thin fire, she held the knitted cloth against her cheek. The child inside stirred and she whispered without meaning to, maybe the world isn't all teeth. Then she shoved the words away, angry at herself for wanting softness, for daring to believe kindness could exist without a trap. Yet when she lay down, the bundle stayed near her pillow, close enough that the scent of mint rose into her dreams. The next morning dawned with a wind sharp enough to rattle the nails already set in her cabin. She worked until her palms split, binding strips of cloth around them so the blood would not smear the wood. With every strike, she told herself she was alone. She was strong, she was enough. But the truth lingered with the smell of ginger on her skin. Maybe strength did not mean refusing every hand offered. Maybe it meant knowing which ones could be trusted, not to close around your throat. The thought gnawed at her, dangerous, unfamiliar. She shook it off, raised the hammer again, and kept building. The week turned colder, the kind of cold that seeped through wool and bone until every breath carried a shard of ice. Eleanor worked still, her hands red and raw, but the cabin walls grew taller and the shape of a home began to whisper back to her in the shadows of each beam. When her body demanded rest, she would sit on the half-finished porch shawl, pulled tight, and listen to the sigh of the pines. She told herself the silence was enough. But silence has edges, and lately it carried the memory of a man's voice speaking of respect. On the 7th morning, Clayton returned without invitation. This time he carried tools instead of bundles, an adze, a saw, and a canteen of water slung across his chest. He did not ask permission. He simply set the saw against a log, tested the grain, and began to cut. The sound startled her, not with fear, but with the foreign comfort of shared labor. She watched him for a long breath, torn between outrage and relief. Finally, she said, "You have no right." "I'm not claiming one," he replied. "Just lending a pair of hands while mine are still steady." For hours they worked without speaking much more. Hammers struck in rhythm, sawdust floated like snow between them. Once when a stubborn plank splintered, Eleanor let out a frustrated laugh. Clayton echoed it softly, and in that small crack of sound, something inside her eased. By the time the sun began to dip, their clothes were dusted with wood shavings, and the cabin had taken on the beginnings of a roof. At dusk, they sat side by side, backs against the frame, watching smoke twist from the chimney that barely drew. He passed her the canteen, and this time she took it without hesitation. The water tasted of tin and trust. It was Eleanor who broke the silence. "I was married once," she said, eyes fixed on the glowing embers. "A proper wedding, ivory gloves, roses, the whole spectacle. 6 months later, he left, said the child wasn't his. I never told him the truth that it was. I let him walk away, papers half signed, never finished. So in the eyes of the law, I am still his wife." Her voice cracked on the last word, a sound more brittle than any board. Clayton sat very still, his profile carved by the firelight. After a long pause, he said quietly, "That's a heavy weight to carry." She gave a dry laugh. "Out here, people already see me as damaged goods. If they knew I was still bound to a man who abandoned me, it would only prove them right." He did not rush to soothe. He let her truth settle between them like snow finding its place on a branch. Finally, he said, "People are quick to judge what they do not understand." She glanced at him, sharp, almost daring. "You haven't asked if I still love him." "I figure if you did," he answered, "you wouldn't be here." The words landed like a hand on her shoulder, steadying, unintrusive. She blinked against the sudden sting in her eyes. After a moment, she asked, almost against her will, And you, a man, doesn't ride alone unless something drove him to. His gaze went to the snowy ridge beyond the clearing. Her name was Sarah, my wife. She loved to race horses. One morning she took a gelding too fast, broke her neck on the rocks east of our ranch. I found her myself. I was 28. That was 5 winters ago. The silence that followed was not empty, but heavy with shared loss. Eleanor's chest tightened. I'm sorry, she whispered. So am I, he said, voice even, but I'm still here. And so are you. The wind howled through the half-set rafters, but for once it did not feel like an enemy. They sat there as the valley darkened, not as widow and abandoned wife, not as rancher's son and stubborn builder, but simply as two people who had lost and somehow kept breathing. In that moment, the cabin around them no longer seemed like just walls and timber. It was the fragile outline of something neither of them had dared to name yet. Late autumn settled like a rumor across the valley. The cabin stood sturdier now, its beams tied by nails and sweat its roofline, rough but promising shelter. Yet with progress came whispers. Wagons carried stories down the trail into Willowbrook of a woman alone in the wilderness, too proud for charity, visited too often by a rancher's son whose fiancé waited in town. Eleanor heard the change in people's voices when she went for flour. The clerk's smile turned tight. The Kowalskis, once warm, asked clipped questions. Each word reminded her that solitude was safer than kindness. One morning as frost glazed the ground, a carriage rolled into her clearing. The woman who stepped down was wrapped in imported wool, her hair pinned in an intricate knot. Victoria Morrison's eyes swept over the half-built porch, the stacked firewood, and finally the swell of Eleanor's belly. Miss Sullivan, she said with polished disdain, whatever arrangement exists between you and Mr. Hartwell must end. Eleanor's voice stayed calm, though her pulse hammered. There is no arrangement. Victoria's smile was sharp as glass. Then end the association. His name is being dragged through parlors from here to the Capitol. I never asked him to come, Eleanor replied, heat rising in her throat. But I did not send him away either, Victoria countered. You let him stay. You let him help. And now my fiancé hesitates to set a wedding date while people wonder if he fathers another woman's child. Anger surged, but Eleanor's words came steady. He is a free man. I have asked nothing of him but kindness. Kindness, Victoria said coldly, can ruin reputations faster than cruelty. You want independence? Take it somewhere else. Sell the land. Vanish before this ends worse. The carriage departed, leaving silence heavier than snow. Eleanor stood on the porch until the cold burned her lungs. Later, she stacked logs, boiled tea, and pressed a hand to the child, shifting beneath her ribs. But Victoria's words lodged deeper than the splinters in her palms. Am I destroying the only good man who ever looked at me without pity? Days passed. Each time wind shook the timbers, she braced for Clayton to appear with anger or farewell. When hoofbeats finally came, she opened the door before his knock. Snow dusted his shoulders, conviction burned in his eyes. I told my father the engagement is off, he said simply. Victoria will not be my wife. Her breath caught. He was furious, threatened to cut me off, called me a fool. But I did not back down. This isn't pity, Eleanor. It isn't rebellion. It's choosing what is real, you, this place, that child. I've seen more truth in the way you hold a hammer than in every ballroom I've ever stood in. Tears pricked hot, but shame tangled with them. You can't throw your future away on a scandal. I'm not throwing anything away, Clayton said. I'm building something new. Her hands trembled as she whispered, there's something you don't know. I never finalized the divorce. By law, I am still another man's wife. You deserve to know before you ruin yourself for someone who cannot give you anything in return. He stepped closer, took her hands rough against rough. You think this changes how I feel? It only makes me want to fight harder. I see what you've endured. You are not a burden. You are braver than anyone I know. The fire cracked, the wind sighed against the cabin walls, and for the first time since Boston, Eleanor let the weight in her chest shift. Not gone, but shared. Deep winter came with a silence so thick it seemed the world itself held its breath. Snow smothered the valley trees, bowed beneath white weight, and the cabin rose like a defiant spark in the wilderness. Inside, Eleanor moved slower, every step heavy with the child, pressing low every breath, clouding in the chill that slipped through unfinished seams. She told herself she could endure anything alone as she always had. But when the knock came steady against the doorframe, her heart answered before her pride could. Clayton entered, snow dripping from his coat, his face red with cold and resolve. "I should not be here," she whispered. "I should be exactly here," he replied, removing his gloves with no hesitation. "I will not live a lie with Victoria. I will not be shamed into a life that means nothing. I choose this, choose you." His words shook her as no storm had. She turned toward the fire, eyes wet with heat and doubt. "You cannot rewrite the law. You cannot silence gossip. You cannot change that I am bound to another man." He stepped closer, voice low. "I am not trying to rewrite anything. I am trying to write what feels true. You, this cabin, that child. Love is not the absence of hardship. It is the choice to stand inside it and still stay." Her body trembled, torn between fear and a longing she no longer dared to name. "You think love makes this easier?" she demanded. "Love does not file papers or buy land or stop a town from branding us a scandal." "He is not a scandal," Clayton said firmly, glancing at her belly. "He is your child, and that makes him more honorable than most men I've known." The words broke her defenses. She turned to the window, shoulders shaking. "I spent every night wondering if I could survive alone. Now someone offers to share the weight, and all I feel is fear. Fear because I loved once and was wrong. Because I trusted and he left without even asking if the child was his." Clayton's steps were quiet as snow. He stood behind her, warmth seeping across the small space between them. "I know what it is to lose," he said, voice frayed by memory. "My wife died on a morning that began like any other. One moment she laughed about my coffee, the next she was gone. I buried her under a cottonwood tree. Since then I have lived as though joy owed me nothing until I rode into this clearing and saw you driving nails like they owed you rent." A startled sound escaped her, half laugh, half sob. She turned and his eyes held no pity, only a raw steadiness. "You are not some broken woman I stumbled upon," he whispered. "You are the fire I did not know I needed, and I will not lose you." Her walls, built plank by plank like the cabin itself, seemed suddenly less certain. She touched his wrist, not to push him away, but to anchor herself. "I do not know how to let you in. I have built walls so long I cannot remember where the door is." He leaned his forehead against hers. "Then let me help you find it." The world narrowed to their breaths, the crackle of the fire, and the fragile thread of hope tying them together. Outside, snow thickened, muffling the forest. Inside, for the first time, Eleanor did not feel entirely alone. The storm came without warning, swallowing the sky in a white roar. By midday, the world beyond the cabin was a wall of snow, and by nightfall, even the pines bent low under its weight. Eleanor lit every lamp laid out, towels, boiled water, her pulse wild with dread. The child inside pressed hard, restless, as if sensing what was coming. When the first contraction struck sharp and merciless, she doubled over against the table and whispered through clenched teeth, "Not now. Not like this." Miles away, Clayton had already saddled his strongest horse, heart pounding with a certainty that defied reason. The air cut like knives, the drifts rose to his thighs, yet he rode. When the horse stumbled and pitched him into a frozen creek, the cold slammed his lungs and his shoulder burned with pain. Dragging himself free, he whispered hoarsely, "She needs me," and forced one step after another through the storm. In the cabin, Eleanor screamed into the night, the sound swallowed by howling wind. She fought, a lone body tearing itself open, blood soaking the rags she had prepared. The storm rattled the walls, but her will did not break. At last, with a cry, raw and fierce, the child came, tiny, slick, alive. A boy. Tears blurred her vision as she cradled him against her chest, whispering every prayer she remembered from childhood. "You'll be safe. Even if it's only me, you'll be safe." But fear gnawed at her, even in triumph. What if Clayton was lost in the storm? What if the only man who had seen her strength and not called it a curse had vanished into the snow forever? Her sobs mingled with the newborn's cries, the two of them a fragile island of sound inside a world gone white. Then a knock, faint at first, then again firmer. She froze. When the door creaked open, wind and snow rushed in with a staggering figure. Clayton. His coat was torn, blood staining his shirt, his face pale with exhaustion, but his eyes still burned. He stumbled to the hearth and fell to his knees. Steam rose from his soaked clothes, his breath ragged. Eleanor's voice cracked. "Clayton!" His gaze moved to the bundle in her arms. The tiny fist pressed against her breast. His lips curved into a broken smile. "Looks like you've already built a family, Miss Sullivan." He murmured, his voice thin but steady. "Mind if I join?" Her throat closed. She could have said no, should have perhaps, but instead she shifted the child into his trembling arms. "Only if you're sure," she whispered. "I've never been more sure," he answered. The baby stirred against his chest. The fire snapped, and outside the storm raged on. But within those rough-hewn walls, warmth took root, a warmth fiercer than blizzards, stronger than loss. For the first time, Eleanor believed she might not face the world alone. The first sign of spring was not flowers, but mud-soft earth giving under Eleanor's boots as she stepped outside with her son nestled against her chest. Thomas slept in a linen sling, his breath warm against her collarbone. The cabin behind her stood solid now, smoke curling steady from the chimney, its timbers weathered by storms, but still strong. Nearby, Clayton drove a post into the ground, pausing to grin at her through sawdust and sweat. "Soil's thawing early," he called. "Or maybe it knows we've got work to do." She smiled, tired but lighter than she had been in years. Maybe both. Inside that small home, laughter had replaced silence. Nights once filled with creaks and fear now carried the sound of crackling fire, soft lullabies, and sometimes the low rumble of Clayton's stories told just to see her smile. They had not exchanged vows before. A preacher had no rings, but neighbors who gathered for stew and lantern-light suppers could see what bound them. Love here was proven in stacked firewood, in hands reaching for one another after long workdays, in the quiet ways they stayed. One afternoon, Eleanor sat at the table with a sheet of blue stationery, her father's old stock. Her hand trembled as she signed the letter addressed to a law office in Boston. It was the final request for divorce from Charles Whitmore, the man who had once left without looking back. When she sealed the envelope, Clayton entered, dust on his sleeves, sun in his smile. "You did it," he said. She nodded. "Last piece of the past sealed and sent." He kissed her forehead gently. "I'm proud of you." They did not celebrate with champagne or applause, but with stew shared with the Kowalskis, with lanterns hung high, and Clayton's voice steady as he raised a tin cup. "She is the strongest woman I've ever known. I thought I was coming here to help her, but she saved me." Eleanor's smile was small but radiant. "No rings," she said softly, "but plenty of roots." Later she found him fitting a new door to the kitchen. Its handle was a bent horseshoe, polished and bolted firm. "Found it near the pasture," he explained. "Thought it was scrap. Turns out it just needed shaping." She traced it with her fingers. "Like some people," she whispered. "Like us," he answered. Wildflowers bloomed across the valley, and Thomas laughed for the first time, bright and unguarded. Eleanor wrote another letter, this one to her late father. Words she would never send but needed to write. "You told me once. A home was not a place, but a feeling. I did not believe you, but now I do. I built these walls with my hands, but it took a stubborn cowboy with dusk in his eyes to make them feel alive. We are not alone anymore." Outside, Clayton mended fences. She carried Thomas to him, the child's laughter floating through the pine-scented air. Clayton looked up, eyes soft, and in that moment, surrounded by mud and wildflowers, and the echo of storm survived. Eleanor understood love here was not given easily, not handed down by law or blessing. It was built log by log, wound by wound, choice by choice, until it became unshakable. Spring had come, and with it everything she had never dared to dream.